Hello, magpies, and welcome back to this exploration of the faiths of Faerun. In this episode, I will be outlining the optional rules for divine casters that I have homebrewed or adapted from previous D&D editions. The rest of this series will reference these rules, so this video will set you on the right path for success. Alright, let us swoop on in. I use 6 optional rules for divine casters. These concern the role of gods in protecting the ability to resurrect after death. They affect the methods and times at which divine casters regain their spells, the access of the faithful to their gods' favoured weapons, the ability of evil clerics to exert control over the undead and the chance for clerics to dispel one another's channel divinities, and finally, how your alignment affects your relationship to your church. And beside these optional rules, I want to briefly touch on 2 rules for storytelling that I regard as golden, being the philosophical foundations upon which the lesser game rules are developed. The first of which regards the very concept of rules in D&D. I have said before, and I think it bears repeating, that maths and game mechanics are the entry level to the hobby, easily mastered, so that we may all begin on the same page, and then quickly turn to the real game at hand, being the construction of a social experience that is more meaningful than any mechanical victory. You see, D&D rules are a bit like religions themselves. Some people take them far too seriously. But a healthy, balanced relationship to any set of dogma, it implies the mature understanding that we each choose to follow rules when they produce a positive outcome and then discard them when they do not. This is how it has always worked. For millions of people, for thousands of years. So the golden rule is that there are no rules except those that work right now. Which means that even a rule acknowledged and adopted once may be disregarded in the next breath if it does not meaningfully produce better outcomes. For when we strip this game down to its core, Dungeons & Dragons, it's really just a bunch of words. So it behooves us to structure our language to situate the story as the subject of our sentence and the pleasure spent together as the object. Everything else is just a means to an end, or merely liminal dogma, yet to outgrow itself. But beneath the social element, it is also important to defer in some ways to a narrative context. All of the optional rules in this video were made with my variant on the Forgotten Realms in mind. It is a world where, for a generation, mortals lost access to divine magic. Without healing or guidance, for a half-century, they struggled under despair, plague, and war. Until at last, a new way of accessing the power of the gods was discovered. Today, it is through the collective effort of many prayers joined together in common practice that divine spellcasters may find their once-lost connection to the gods, representing a communal rather than an individual relationship with the divine and placing a particular emphasis upon homogeneity of practice, while at the same time framing the real or perceived threat of heterodoxy and heresy that evokes the generational trauma of a dark age so recently past. The optional rules that I present in this video are curated to complement that storyverse. The second rule, therefore, is that the story creates the rules, and not the other way around. Alright, ready? It's homebrew time. The first rule I call Mortal Petitioners. It encourages players to consider their characters' religious beliefs. This need not be any kind of devout worship that intrudes upon your storytelling experience, as indeed any relationship, even one with a god that expects obedience that is in conflict with your nature, is toxic, and no one should have to fuck with that. Likewise, with 144 gods to choose from, you should have no trouble finding one that suits your temperament. That's the carrot, anyway. The stick is that if an entirely irreligious person should die, then after 1d10 days without a god to keep their soul safe in an afterlife, they simply cease to exist. But it need not be a matter of existential dread. Some cultures might believe that the soul is reincarnated or returns to a cosmic oneness that even the gods themselves are a part of. Maybe even being suffused into the weave itself. Or some individuals may simply prefer non-existence to the alternative of having their soul being the kept pet of a god for all eternity. The choice ultimately belongs to the players, and to their characters, the consequences. Next, the Holy Time rule represents congregations of worshippers collectively agreeing upon a time of day or night that is sacred to their order, at which time they unite and join their prayers together through strength in unity and thus facilitate divine magic. In this way, even the most powerful divine casters will owe their spells to the benevolent devotion of lowly farmers. Each entry for a god will outline times, holidays, and rites for the devout to observe. How it works on paper is that when a divine caster finishes a long rest, they recover all of their abilities as per normal, but in order to recover spells, they must observe the practices of their faith at the designated time and in the designated way, performing a ritual of devotion for a number of minutes equal to the combined level of all of the spells they wish to recover. For example, a cleric of Lathander the Morning Lord, wishing to recover 3 third-level spells, would observe the sunrise for 9 minutes. The key component for DMs running this rule is to be flexible in your expectations. Despite their best intentions to create a unified faith, some cultures and communities may use radically different methods to contact the divine, including obscure mysticism, weird artifacts, and stranger technology, the intercedence of celestial patrons, or just freak phenomena that surpasses description. A lot of players are understandably averse to strict obligations in a game about freedom, and you should always provide them a narrative alternative. But spare a thought as well for the battle strategies that could emerge from this system of ritualistic spell recovery. Imagine a dawn raid by some clerics of a sun god who expend all of their resources in a single assault, and then quickly withdraw using the dawn light to blind their enemies and their martial fighters to cover their retreat. And then, a few minutes later, they return with all of their spells fully restored. Genuine nightmare fuel. Likewise, I think we may take it as a given that all but the most capricious gods want their followers to succeed. So if their dogma requires, say, sunlight as part of a morning ritual, then those who regularly explore dungeons deep underground may be given a brief remission from their obligations as others pray on their behalf. Or perhaps, if the task is most vital, such as saving the world, the god may even send a minor celestial each morning to carry pieces of sunlight deep underground to bless their champion. But consider as well that it is one thing to draw up a devout character concept on paper, and it is another to maintain it for a whole campaign. I've had players roll up institutional paladins and clerics and then respond to any request made of their faith like they were 14-year-olds being told to turn off the Xbox and go to bed. I find it helpful to think of religious dogma like a rubber band. The rules are made to be stretched, but the further you push it, the harder it will snap back. And when it does, you should make sure that your players understand that the consequences are not a punishment, but rather a story opportunity. It could be a chance for a redemption arc, like a coming-of-age road trip movie. It could be a special quest, just for them, a pilgrimage, a repentance, or a vision quest, designed to deepen role-playing bonds to their mentors, peers, and congregations to whom they owe their powers. It could be a story where their character gets to look deep within themselves and try to understand why it is that they are compelled to rebel, and ultimately whether organized religion is truly right for them. But remember as well that even an unrepentant character who gives you no choice but to strip them of their powers can be the hero of a great story. Organized religion is not for everyone, no matter how much they may like the class abilities or the Deus Vult memes. And you shouldn't permanently cripple a character just because their player tried something new and failed. To this end, you should always allow former divine casters to trade their redundant levels for some other class, after an appropriate journey of self-discovery and retraining, of course. The story of a person who learns to walk away from their faith and who finds a way of living that is better suited to their temperament. That should be a beautiful and compelling thing. Okay, so we got a little bit abstract and philosophical there, so let's balance it out by exercising our left side brain with the more mechanical favored weapon rule. Each entry for a god will list the weapon personally wielded by the deity, and many clerics will use a facsimile of that weapon as their spiritual weapon spell. Furthermore, clerics, paladins, and druids, if it fits the narrative theme, they all gain proficiency in their god's chosen weapon, with a few caveats. To demonstrate, we will use a few examples from different gods. Grumbar, the earth god's favoured weapon, is a stony fist, which would make for a very thematic spiritual weapon. So in brackets, I indicate that their followers imitate this weapon by training in the Warhammer. Probably a stone Warhammer, shaped like a fist, something like that. Likewise, Gwaran Windstrom, the god of tracking, has a named weapon, Flameheart, while his followers use the Greatsword, or perhaps a two-handed flamberge to imitate the flames on the weapon. The harvest goddess Chauntea, she wields a shock of grain, but while whipping people with grass stalks in combat might well sting a bit, her clerics find it more effective to wield a scythe, following the agricultural theme. However, there is no entry in the player's handbook for scythes. So we put scythe in square brackets, indicating that it is a unique weapon, and we say that it follows the statistics of a halberd, which we put afterwards in regular brackets. Therefore, a cleric of Chauntea would gain proficiency in the scythe, but not necessarily in the halberd. Finally, if there are any variant rules accompanying the weapon, it will be included in the regular brackets beside the equivalent weapon. For example, Malar, the god of the hunt, uses a beast's claw, while his divine casters use a claw bracer that follows the rules for a dagger, except that it cannot be used as a ranged weapon. So, the formula you'll see is the god's weapon is listed first, and the weapon used by their followers comes second. Unique weapons without official rules will be in square brackets, and their equivalent will follow, indicating which rules the weapon will follow, including any rules variants. Simple. Alright. So next, the Rebuke and Command Undead rule provides a variant to the Turn Undead ability, to control rather than to defeat the Undying. Each god entry will have a section called Channel Divinity that will list which version they grant to their clerics. If your god grants Rebuke Undead, it will replace Turn Undead, and Command Undead will likewise replace Destroy Undead. In a few cases, a neutral god may have an asterisk after their entry, indicating that in rare examples they may grant the opposite ability to a follower with a certain purpose in mind. For example, an amoral cult of Gond might well utilize Undead to run eternally in a giant hamster wheel to power mechanical devices, but such cases are rare, though they are memorable. Rarer still, some gods may be so indifferent to the distinction between life and death that they offer both abilities to their followers, in which case the player chooses one at character creation and may never change thereafter. So, Rebuke Undead works exactly the same as Turn Undead, except that if the target fails their saving throw, they are charmed for 1 minute or until they take any damage, and will either be enthralled or cowed, depending upon their temperament. They may not take any actions other than the dodge action or speaking if they could normally speak, and they cannot take reactions. Note that undead that are immune to charm effects cannot be rebuked. Command Undead works similar to Destroy Undead in that you can only target undead of a certain challenge rating, following the same level progression, except that when a viable undead is rebuked, you gain the ability to command it. As an action, you may issue an order to your rebuked undead which they must obey, even if they are mindless or do not share a language with you. This may be a task that they could reasonably perform. Like, you couldn't have a mindless zombie do your maths homework, but you could have them eat your homework. You may only have a number of hit dice of undead equal to your cleric level commanded at once, and you may end the command effect at any time. Note that when the rebuke effect wears off, command also ends. but mindless undead will continue to perform simple tasks indefinitely until disturbed, such as digging or walking in a single direction. For example, zombies have 3 hit dice, so a 9th level cleric that rebukes 5 zombies could command 3 of them, while the other 2 remained rebuked. After commanding those 3 to walk east, he could then relinquish control and then command the other 2 to follow. The next optional rule allows clerics to counter one another's control over the undead. Starting at 2nd level, all clerics gain an additional channel divinity power called Dispel Turning. It works a lot like Rebuke Undead, but it only targets undead who are currently turned, rebuked, or commanded by another caster. You make a spell attack roll, and if you roll higher than the opposing cleric's spell save DC, then the affected undead may act normally. If there are multiple groups of undead within range that are affected by different casters, then you roll once against all spell save DCs together and then determine success separately. For example, let's say you use Dispel Turning against 2 groups of undead, one being zombies rebuked by a cleric with a spell save DC of 12, and the other being skeletons rebuked and commanded by a cleric with a spell save DC of 15. So if you roll a 14 for your spell attack, the zombies are no longer rebuked, but the skeletons remain commanded. Finally, the favoured alignment rule. Well, it isn't really a rule per se, but rather food for thought as to how your divine caster feels about the ideology and the structure of their church, and how much consternation they cause their superiors, their mentors, and their peers. You simply locate your god's alignment on this chart. Typically, followers of a god tend to be of the same or adjacent alignments to their god, either one step over, up, or down. For example, a chaotic good god would usually attract chaotic good, chaotic neutral, and neutral good clergy. The exception is the true neutral alignment. Neutrality is, by definition, an exclusionary and extremist position, and therefore true neutral devotees tend to only follow true neutral gods that reflect their own high standards of disengagement. The bottom line is, however, don't worry too much if your alignment is not adjacent to your gods. Maybe you just don't fit in, or maybe you have found a way to fit in by being different. Even a chaotic god who only cares about throwing wild parties will need a couple of lawful priests to run the party planning committee. And every party has that one insufferable attendee who goes out of their way to tell everybody how neutral and unbiased they are. Ultimately, even if your character is an unwanted pariah in their own faith, conflict and contradiction make for relatable storytelling. So, with all of the rules out of the way, there's really not much more to say except then to observe that all game rules that do not relate to respecting the table and one another are flexible. Get creative, and feel free to think outside of the suggested domains for a given god. If you want to play a grave domain cleric, you don't need to pick a god associated with death. Try a nature god, for death is a part of nature after all. Or try a god of knowledge, for the dead must have their names recorded. Take it from me, an actual dead person. Alright, that's it. Thank you, magpies. And now with the entrees out of the way, we can begin the main course of all 144 gods. I hope you're pumped. I know I am. And I will talk to you again real soon.